unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to unSILOed. This is Greg LeBlanc. I'm here today with Margaret Heffernan, who is at the University of Bath in the UK. In addition to working at the university, you also spend a lot of time with CEOs. You have a background as a business person, also a background as a creative person. And we'll have to talk about how you can do both of those things. And also the author of a bunch of books. There are some books that I don't have, but I do have what I think of as a trilogy, which started, I think, maybe, was it 10 years ago or so? Maybe more, with this one, this classic called Willful Blindness, Why We Ignore the Obvious at Our Peril, which must be in like its gazillionth printing.
Pretty much.
Right. And then it was followed up by this one called Uncharted, How to Navigate the Future. And most recent book is called Embracing Uncertainty, How Writers, Musicians, and Artists Thrive in an Unpredictable World. Welcome, Margaret.
Thank you very much. It's really nice to be talking to you.
Well, I don't know whether you think of these as a trilogy, but when I read them, I see them as sort of emerging out of themes in the previous books, right? So the Embracing Uncertainty book, there's a whole chapter in Uncharted, which is all about the artist and how the artist is comfortable with uncertainty, right? And how we need a new type of manager, one that is maybe tapping into these artistic sensibilities. And then, of course, Uncharted, which is really about the pathologies of prediction and the quest for certainty. I mean, this comes, I think, straight out of Willful Blindness. So maybe we could start off, I have two questions. One is, do you think of these as a trilogy? Do you think of there being this theme that runs through all of your work? And then secondly, how does the themes in your work actually relate to your life? I mean, you wrote plays, for crying out loud, which is not something that a business professor ever does, right? To what extent does your experience with both business and the arts, give you a unique perspective on some of maybe the pathologies of organizational behavior and design?
Yeah, sure. Very perceptive. I do think I've written a trilogy, but I conceive of it slightly differently, which is it definitely started with Willful Blindness. There was a book after that called A Bigger Prize, which I think is the sort of unloved middle child in the sense that I still am very fond of it, but I think it was a step too far for quite a lot of my reading public. And when I'd written that book, my husband said to me, "I think you're writing a trilogy." And I said, "What's the third book?" And he didn't know, and I didn't know. But I think the third book was Uncharted. But it is certainly the case that almost every book I've written, every chapter could have been its own book. And in many ways, Embracing Uncertainty is the book version of a chapter in Uncharted, but with a lot more research and a lot more up to date, I guess. But yes, they are, they're all entangled in each other. I think partly because I pay a lot of attention to what isn't being said, what isn't being done, what's missing, when things go wrong, what might have made it better. So I'm asking a lot of questions as somebody who's had a really very rewarding career in business, about what could make this better for everybody, what could make it less dangerous, both physically less dangerous, which is, part of Willful Blindness, looks at a lot of industrial accidents, kind of morally, ethically less dangerous, socially, politically less dangerous. Why can't we do a lot of the great stuff that we do without hurting people or without people getting hurt along the way? So I think I bring to the work that I do both a real love of work, because I've been able to have a very rewarding career, but also, if you like, a very friendly skepticism about whether we're doing it as well as we could for everybody.
Well, a big theme of your work is this quest for certainty. And, I've always thought of business people as folks who are trying to carve out some predictability and certainty
Yeah.
in a chaotic world. I mean, that's what organizations do, right? That's their main task in some sense. And, but the problem with uncertainty is that it is both a phenomenon in the external world and sort of a subjective state of being. And so people, maybe if they can't impose a little more predictability on the world, they will sort of imagine it inside their heads, and then they are predictably surprised. But I think when you start off the Embracing Uncertainty book, you start off with this wonderful thought experiment, which is we all think we want certainty, but when you push it to its limits, people realize that you really don't want,
you really
certainty,
don't. Beware
right?
what you wish for. Absolutely. No, it's funny. I mean, it was a completely random kind of moment when I was waiting for a train and started thinking about, after a station announcement that said the train will arrive at, platform 2 in 3 minutes, super precise prediction. And I started thinking about, well, imagine if all of our predictions were that perfect, what would life be like? And of course, and I expand this to audiences when I'm doing lots of speaking engagements, and at first everybody just loves the idea that the train's going to be on time, and, the doctor's appointment is going to be easy to schedule, and the groceries are going to arrive at the right time in the right place with just what you want to eat. And gradually, as this unspools, the look of delight turns to one of horror as you realize that it transforms life into just a kind of giant to-do list, at the end of which is you die. And I think that, because uncertainty makes us anxious, we think the opposite would make us happy. And I think that's entirely wrong. And then I remember during the pandemic, in fact, I spent some time talking to the German psychologist Gerd Gigerenzer, who's, very brilliant on the subject of heuristics and quite a contrarian. And he was talking about how in his own research, he saw that, people don't want to know what they're getting for their birthday. They don't want to know on the day they're getting married whether the marriage will last or not. Almost nobody wants to know the day that they're going to die, because then that means the whole of your life is in countdown mode. So I thought, well, maybe it's time to revisit this thing. And maybe we could become more comfortable with uncertainty if we realize that it's actually the space in which we have freedom and choice. And to the degree that we cling to certainty, we are abandoning the freedom and choice that we currently have. And I'm not sure that's what we really want to do, but I'm sure that it is rapidly becoming an option.
Well, where does this aversion to uncertainty come from? I mean, I imagine that there's a bit of it that is hardwired across all of us, but it seems like a lot of it is context dependent. It's a function of stress levels. It's a function of maybe aspects of the culture. I mean, where does it come from?
Well, I think it comes from a lot of things. I think, of course, there's a lot in life that's uncertain, and of course, we're anxious about it. A lot of people are anxious on planes, wondering if they're going to crash, not because they don't know the data, but because the whole act of flying seems so counterintuitive, right? So I think that's a sort of gut reaction to something which is intrinsically very unnatural. I think, in my book, I wrote about, just a simple thing like a plan to meet my husband and go to the movies. You can just rapidly unspool all the things that could go wrong and the people you'd piss off because you were late or you didn't make dinner or whatever. So there is a huge amount of uncertainty baked into our lives. And two things I think have happened. One is as we get busier, the level of anxiety increases because our margins for error are getting tighter. So if you take that very simple example of, can I meet my husband in time to go to the movies and have dinner? The answer in a if you like, more relaxed world would have been, yeah, I can leave home earlier.
Well, it's like the Instacart drivers. If they have like 8 deliveries that they have to do on one run, then, one small traffic delay is just going to ricochet through all 8 deliveries, right?
Exactly. Some dog runs across the road and this guy gets dinged because he doesn't do his deliveries in time. So some of it is that we now have the capacity and the technology, and in many instances, the pressure to cut these margins and make life ever, ever, ever more efficient. And the more we do that, the more anxious we become, because the cost of getting things wrong gets higher. And the expectation that everything will go right, it becomes much more intense. So I think, first of all, that our devotion to efficiency has become a little out of control. That's significantly been driven by the self-help industry. And
time blocking, right? Where you have every moment of your calendar filled to the brim.
And, and I've got to do my Pomodoro method, and I've got to do this, and I've got to do the other. And, if I'm a real world beater, then I can really cram a billion things into a day. And what we don't realize we're doing at the time is we're making the likelihood of something fail very much greater as we take all of those margins away. So that has made us much more stressed, as has our belief that the technology is right and we're wrong. So, and a banal way I think about this is, I travel quite a lot, and I use sat-nav to get to places I haven't been to before. I think it's a fantastic technology. But I can tell you one thing for sure, which is in times of estimating what time I'll arrive, it's almost invariably wrong, right? Because it can't be right? It doesn't know when a dog's going to run into the road. It doesn't know when a car in front of me is going to get a flat tire. It doesn't know when I'm going to get a flat tire. So it's an estimate, it's a prediction, but we have invested it with a kind of absolutism. And of course, the makers of it have done similarly. So we have somehow been persuaded that we can both be super efficient and technology will make sure that we get nothing wrong. And so our expectations are simply too high. But the higher the expectations, the higher the stress level, if anything kind of throws a tiny, tiny, tiny little stick into the machine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I work with executives a lot. And one of the exercises that I have them do is to go through and examine the way in which they allocate time.
Yeah.
And I find that most of them, they'll fill up their calendars to the brim with planned work. And then all sorts of, firefighting happens, which overwhelm that. And so any time they might have for strategic thinking gets squeezed out. And I think you refer to creative thinking. I mean, I think strategic thinking and creative thinking are very, very similar in that they both require, observation and patience, right? So, I mean, to what extent is creative thinking the thing that gets, squeezed out by all of this busyness and the quest for certainty?
It's a wonderful question because I mentor at any one time probably 4 or 5 chief executives of very large global businesses. And I often think that actually the single most important thing I do is they block out 3 hours a month in their calendar when we think together. And I would love to say that I give them brilliant ideas. I don't. I give them the space in which they can come up with their own brilliant ideas.
You're like a personal trainer.
A little bit, because actually, these are very accomplished people. And given the time and space and some good questions, for the most part, they're quite capable of figuring out what they need to do. But the fact that they have to block it out is the biggest gift I think I bring to them often. But I think there's something else really important here, which is, and you've used the word context a couple of times. And I think we often think about businesses. I'm sure I've been guilty of this running my own. We think of them absent context. We forget that every business exists in society. It exists within a market. It exists within geopolitical realities, many of which things we have very little influence or control over, but which are going to impact what we do and the consequences of our decisions. So a good decision has to take account of those, which means you have to be pretty sensitive to your environment. And if you're running around trying to do 2 million things before lunchtime, and you have, as you say, very neatly scheduled out thinking time, I would suggest the first thing that goes is our sense of context, of what is the environment in which our decisions are going to play out. And that, I think, is where things often go very, very, very badly wrong. So we start living in a kind of mental universe which gets further and further away from reality. Now, if you layer in right, all the perks of huge business success so that you're being driven to work. I mean, the great example of this, I think I cite in Willful Blindness, was Dick Fuld, who ran Lehman Brothers, who would be driven to his helipad, helicoptered into Manhattan, driven to his office, and then went up, to the top floor in a private elevator, which meant at no point did he ever see a normal human being. Nowhere did he see real life going on around him. Well, to say that he was in a bubble would be an understatement, right? He was in a steel box most of his life. So the fact that he didn't quite pick up the vibes is no surprise to me at all. And neither should it have been to him. So if you layer in, living with people, surrounding yourself with people who by and large are going to agree with you, cutting yourselves off from the context in which your business operates, being too busy to think, well, then of course you're going to make spectacular errors. How could you possibly not? And when it comes to creative thinking, what have you got to work with? You've got no material. It's like you get to make a movie, but there's no script because you haven't actually been in the world where your products and your decisions make an impact.
Yeah, but I think you're drawing parallels between two things that seem to be different, right? So one is when you have an expectation about how the world is going to work and it turns out to be different, and right, having an opinion and then you encounter sort of things that might disconfirm your opinions, right? But it seems like you connect them in the sense that they're both about having a model and having some challenge to that model that surfaces either because of data or because of some person you're working with is sort of, confronting you. And so, I mean, what's the connection there between the desire for certainty and the desire for, confirmation about one's opinions?
Yeah. Well, I think all of us want a degree of certainty. And to be fair, a lot of us have a degree of certainty in the sense that I am reasonably confident, that I'm going to go to bed tonight, I'm going to wake up tomorrow morning, I'm going to brush my teeth, and the house is still going to be here, right? So I think we shouldn't get too obsessed by how much uncertainty there is. And I also think we should be alert to actually how well we cope with a great deal of it, right? Everybody has a mental model. We actually couldn't function in the world at all without mental models. If everything were brand new to us every day, we couldn't, we probably wouldn't get very far past brushing our teeth in the morning. But the danger of mental models is that they will attract confirming evidence and marginalize or disguise disconfirming data. And so, the antidotes to that are certainly about having enough time to be in different places with different people who think differently, having a sufficiently open mind to be prepared to notice disconfirmation, having an open mind prepared to change one's mind, and having, I guess, a way of thinking that tends more towards skepticism. And I think to take that out of the abstract, I think it has to do with, I guess, a habit of mind, which is if something is portrayed to you as a binary, so it's either this or that, then there's a lot of information that's not on the table, right? And I think this is where both scientists and artists have a very similar mindset, which is what they're drawn to is the space in between those two things. And not just because that's where that may be a much safer space, but because that's where opportunity, innovation, imaginative, creative thinking can take place. And so the certainty, the sort of elusive or deceptive certainties of binaries, because they simplify, are incredibly dangerous. And every time I'm in a board meeting now or a senior leadership team meeting, as soon as we get into binaries, the first thing I'll do is think, what's the best question I can ask to disrupt this? Not in an aggressive way, but as a way of saying, hang on a second, there's more to this than just A, good, and B, bad.
Well, look, I mean, if there's an optimal amount of uncertainty, if you're trying to both perform and be happy, right? It seems like there's also an optimal amount of learning that one can do from history, right? So you talk a lot about how, you can over-rely and basically fight the last war. I think you refer to it as sort of the, Maginot Line approach to things. But then you also point out that when people don't have memory, the capacity to store memories, then they also become really, really bad at predicting the future. So, I mean, I think in data science, we talk about overfitting versus underfitting.
Exactly.
And it seems to be like that's something that really good managers are good at, sort of avoiding those two pitfalls.
I completely agree. And I think that if you know no history, right, then you're way underfitting because you think everything you do is brand new, unique, and the world's never seen it before, and that's a failure to learn. And when you use history as analogy, which has become very fashionable of late, I think you run the risk that you're overfitting, which is you think, okay, it's exactly like this, so exactly the same thing's going to happen. And I think when I was researching Uncharted, I went and talked to a lot of historians, and what really interested me was that not one of them believes that history repeats itself. Not one. Right?
They might think it rhymes.
Yeah, everybody knows it rhymes, but just because it rhymes doesn't mean it means anything, right? So the danger of thinking history repeats itself is exactly the danger of overfitting and infusing the present analogy with inevitability, and thereby cutting yourself off from being able to change the story. And, whether in life or in business, we know that the same story is capable of multiple different ends. And so keeping alive in our minds what those possibilities are is how you find opportunity to rewrite the history so that it has a better ending.
Well, you recount the story of the scenario planning group at Shell, which is, I think, justly famous, right?
Yeah.
And it's kind of surprising that not a lot of organizations have really tried to implement something similar. I mean, what's so difficult about, that kind of scenario planning?
Yeah. Well, I'd say a couple of things. First of all, scenario planning does seem to me to be making a comeback. as people come to grips with the fact that all the data in the world is still not going to give them certainty. And as I think most business leaders now appreciate that we are in a moment of great uncertainty, there is something about the flexibility and the non-binary character of scenario planning that is really deeply helpful. So I think there's very good reason why it's making a comeback. I think the reason it disappeared for a long time is a couple of things. First of all, we went through this period of, data is the new oil. All you need is masses and masses and masses of data, and then you can know the future. And then, thank God, the academic researchers into forecasting came galloping over the hill to say, actually, you know what, boys? All the data in the world isn't going to tell you the future because there is no data for the future. And because however much you have, you're putting it into a model, and however big your model is, it isn't as big as the world. And so, yes, you can make forecasts not very far out, not much more than about a year out for a good degree of accuracy. And no matter how great a forecaster you are, there are always going to be things that just come as a complete surprise because they are, if you like, endemically uncertain. And, it was really fun. It was sort of funny, peculiar, rather than funny, ha-ha. Uncharted came out, at least in the UK, in February 2020.
Yeah, great
so
timing.
Right on the brink.
You actually mentioned pandemic planning, I think, at the end of the book.
I mentioned pandemic planning at the end of the book, but there's a reference to epidemics, I think on something like page 3. And the reason is not because I could see COVID coming. Let's get that off the table right away. The reason was because talking to epidemiologists, they told me their idea of a joke. And their idea of a joke is, if you've seen one epidemic, you've seen one epidemic. And what they mean by that is it's in the nature of epidemics that they will happen. They have always happened throughout human history. We can be absolutely certain of that. Unfortunately, we don't know when the next one's going to start, or where, or what the pathogen will be. So this is the perfect image or representation of uncertainty, which is we know enough to be worried, but we don't know enough to be able to frame an action plan. So in a world where management has been defined by planning, this is everybody's worst nightmare. And I think what the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness did, which has been absolutely brilliant, is it said, okay, in ages of uncertainty, you can't plan, but you can prepare. You can prepare for scenarios where there is a high likelihood and where you understand it's possibly going to make a big impact. And that's the sort of heuristic that they used, was impact and likelihood when they started developing vaccines for diseases which they knew would make a very big impact if there were an epidemic of that disease, and where they knew there was a likelihood that could take place. Because obviously they couldn't develop, they could, but it'd be ungodly expensive. They couldn't develop vaccines for every disease in the world. It would be ungodly expensive, and most of it would be wasted. So you have to focus in on the piece of the problem that matters the most. And then, as a matter of resilience, you invest in preparing for that because it gives you some options.
Well, look, as somebody...
And I think, for me, this is the mindset shift which businesses kind of started to understand during the pandemic. And then as soon as it was over, they kind of threw it out and moved on. And I think that was a terrible mistake because uncertainty is there as much as ever. The stakes are as high as ever. And there are certainly all sorts of potential, if not active crises, for which we can't plan, but for which we could be preparing.
Well, look, as someone who teaches the social sciences for a living, I would hate to I would hate for it to be the case that learning more social science makes you an inferior decision maker, but it does seem like there is something to that, right? I mean, you talk about go all the way back to Fisher and Babson, and it seems like, when I look at my students who are, say, financial engineers, I mean, they fall in love with their models, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of these models suffer from physics envy, right? So they're talking about humans, but they kind of want humans to behave like, particles. And so, I mean, is there something to that notion that maybe the more social science you get at university, this could potentially damage you as a manager? I mean, is it a substitute for, is it squeezing out some of the, I guess, more artistic or creative sensibilities that you might need to be a good manager?
It's a fantastic question and a very good day on which to ask it, because I wrote a piece which appeared in the Financial Times.
I saw that
yesterday.
Yeah, I saw that.
And a reader wrote to me, and he's an engineer, and he had written a letter to the editor, quibbling with the piece. But in fact, we then started having really fantastic correspondence, the two of us, because he said he'd written a piece about how engineers should study philosophy. And I think the issue is not that social sciences are a bad thing to study, but but I think we have to emphasize that what you gain through social science is an understanding, which is an interpretation. The models are a way of looking at the world, but they are not the world. Psychology is a way to understand people, but they are not the same. Psychology is not the same as people. And I think, psychology has had this, huge problem with the replicability of its experiments. A lot of people taken to task for fraud. A lot of articles had to be, redacted or withdrawn. And I mean, you can draw two conclusions from that. One is that the world of social psychology is full of scallywags, which I think is unlikely to be truer of that discipline than any other discipline. Or you could say that actually the problem is that the underlying mental model they're using is that human beings are as consistent as machines, but they're not. They're absolutely not. I have coffee most mornings for breakfast, and then one morning I'll think, I'd rather have a chamomile tea, right? The great glory of human beings is that we keep changing, right? Neuroplasticity, one of the great discoveries of the 20th century. What does that mean? It means it's going to be really hard to replicate your experiments. That's what it means. And the only way to make social psychology perfectly replicable is for everybody to lose their inconsistency and their diversity. Well, that's a terrible thing to hope for. So I don't decry the social sciences. I decry their physics envy, because I think that they're trying to engineer out the flexibility, inconsistency, and uncertainty that is endemic to the subject. And, a different way of putting it, much simpler maybe, is, Paul Krugman's fantastically explosive remark, which I just love, which is, his sort of off-the-cuff reflection that, well, maybe the data that didn't make it into my models was more important than the data that did. I mean, there's somebody who seems to me has a healthy respect for what models can do and what they can't. And if you're going to start going to trying to model human behavior, well, I think you have to accept, it's almost a kind of Hippocratic oath, that human beings are not consistent, and therefore your data can't be.
Well, look, I mean, you cite a lot of the regularities that have been replicated from social science, whether it's Ash or Milgram or Zimbardo or Simons or Janis,
Yeah.
right? And, they all seem to point in the same direction, which is that, right, it takes a lot of courage to be different in certain
Yes.
environments, right?
Yes.
Do you think that it seems like this problem never goes away. I mean, you go back to Enron. I mean, again, here we are in 2025 and we see the same stuff happening over and over and over again. So what is it about this desire to enforce conformity from the top, which continues to persist? I mean, with all that we know about the harmful consequences of this, why haven't sort of CEOs and leaders and, deans and everybody else decided that it's time to move on from that and to encourage dissent? I mean, Reed Hastings has this wonderful term he calls, dissent farming. But it seems like it's still the exception rather than the rule.
I think that's the case. I mean, it'd be very interesting to see if it's equally the case in different countries. When I've spent a lot of time going around the world talking about willful blindness, and every place I've gone to has said that it's uniquely bad in their culture, which suggests to me that it's probably pretty much the same in every culture.
Well, I mean, that in itself is kind of interesting because normally we're better at spotting the flaws in others,
in
right?
Other people.
Yeah.
I mean, I think in organizations, there is a tendency to think, well, if everybody behaves the same way, it will be more orderly. And obviously that's true up to a point. But there's also a point where if everybody behaves the same way and thinks the same way, the creativity of the organization will absolutely die in its tracks. So I think that our obsession with efficiency means that we may prioritize management over productivity. And critical to productivity is diversity, debate, dissent, because this is how bad ideas get turned into good ideas. As a CEO, I could waltz into work one day with an idea which I thought was, fantastic. And the great gift I was given, where a lot of employees would think, oh God, here comes Margaret with another terrible idea, and say, well, I don't know, what if we did it like this? Or what if we did it like that? Or if we, instead of doing it the way you described, we did it a different way. And at the end of a very long process, you end up with something which started with my bad idea and gradually got a lot better because of everybody else's input and turns out to be marvelous at the end. But that dissent is absolutely fundamental to the creative process. In the same way that when I'm writing a sentence, I'm having an argument in my head with this word or that word or adverbs, or should I stop the sentence and start a new one or put in a comma or whatever. That kind of endless debate is fundamental to invention, discovery, research, innovation. And so it absolutely fundamentally depends on dissent. Now, there are many people who would argue that that quality of dissent makes it harder to manage people. And it may be that it does. But in that case, we're teaching management and leadership, in my opinion, the wrong way. I mean, I've had the huge good fortune to work for people for whom dissent was, mother's milk. They like nothing better than a really good stretching debate about how should we do this, or should we do this at all? I think if you read, Sarah Wynne Williams's hair-raising story of life at Facebook, that monster of a business might be in a very different place had there been dissent instead of this kind of court of a king and queen, where everybody was a courtier bowing and scraping to some truly lethal, horrible decisions. So why is there less dissent, than agreement? all sorts of things. Most people are very uncomfortable with conflict. Very few people have any training in how to do it well. Lots of people grow up in families where dissent was frowned upon, if not actively punished. Our education system teaches people, if you want to get through it well, for every question, there is one right answer. And if you get the right answer, then you're clever and you're smart and all the goodies of the world await you. And if you don't get that answer, well, then you're stupid and, desperation and destitution await you. So there's a great deal that we do to inculcate obedience, conformity, and second guessing, which, in my opinion, is exactly the opposite of what a good, robust education system should do.
Well, look, sometimes the CEOs are ignorant of what's going on because the people who work for them don't have the courage to stand up and say anything. And of course, that could be because the CEO is discouraging it. But it seems like even if people are a bit timid, there are going to be these subtle signals. And so it seems like if leaders were just better noticers, then they might actually sort of, sniff the smoke, so to speak, right?
Yeah, I totally agree.
And then maybe dig a little deeper. But I think, they're not great noticers. And you, I think, are making the claim that being a noticer can be practiced. I mean, this is sort of Max Bazerman makes the same point. And I think you reference him in one of your books. Is developing an artistic sensibility, I mean, what's the relationship between being a noticer and being creative?
Well, it's impossible to be creative without being a noticer, for a start. Mm-hmm. And I think that the great value of being observant and thinking about what you see is it keeps you much more in touch with what's going on in the world. And that takes us back to what we touched upon earlier, which is the sense that all organizations function within the world, and therefore being attuned to how well connected is your organization to the world is, I think, a fundamental job of leadership. Right? It has it faces in two directions, leadership, inside and outside. And in general, what I found is that CEOs tend to be very good at one and less good at the other. But the best CEOs, they have a weakness, but they do take both deeply, deeply seriously. I think, the big issue for people with power is frequently that they don't realize how dangerous their own power is. They're often not very alert to the fact that everybody around them is trying to please them. Everybody around them is trying to say what they think you want to hear. And that power is very disruptive. That if you cut somebody off, that will be interpreted. It is impossible to walk into a room as a CEO and to be a neutral presence. So it's important to be alert to when should you not be in the room in order to ensure a freer quality of conversation. So in a little tiny book that I wrote, which was commissioned by TED, I told a story about the chap who ran the project which led to the first ever substitute for CFCs. And one of the things he told me about... Okay. But one of the things he told me about that was that crucial to coming up with a replacement, bearing in mind that nobody knew if such a thing could be done, crucial to it was his staying out of it. Because if he'd sat in on all the meetings of, well, could we do this, could we do that, everybody would have been watching to see when did his eyes light up, when was he bored. For many of the CEOs I work with, their alertness to their own power often comes quite late, especially if they've risen up through the ranks, because they think, these are my pals, they know me, right? Well, yes, they do and they don't. The minute you get the CEO title, you're, in their eyes, a very different person. And all leadership requires really being attuned to that. I think it also requires and this is really difficult. It requires humility when the world is worshiping you, humility and a sense of your own frailty when the world is throwing hundreds of millions of dollars at you. It's very hard not to feel that you're somehow special. But the minute you start thinking that, you're in trouble.
Well, you talk about some CEOs, they hire their own fools, right? I mean, or, devil's advocates. Although we all know that, King Lear's fool did not have a happy ending. I mean,
no, he didn't. He didn't. And while he was willing to speak truth to power, he himself had no power. I mean, I think back a lot to people who were very willing to tell me the truth as they found it, and I don't think I appreciated them enough. I did appreciate them. But I think if you can't look around your organization and find some of those people, you better start trying to create them. Because it's not about you. It's not about, are you a good guy? Do you like listening? Do you respect other people? You can respect other people from now till doomsday. If you have empathy for them, you have to see how they see you. And however much you may feel you don't have power, if you're in the top job, you do. And that will change how people relate to you, how they communicate to you. It will change how you think about yourself. And the best CEOs I've worked with are fantastic self-monitors. They realize that, yes, they have power, but that's the biggest problem on their plate, which is knowing when and how to use it. Just having it isn't a solution.
Well, you talk about these two different types of artists, the provincial artists and the parochial artists. Right?
Yeah.
And I think that relates back to your point about how managers have to, pay attention. I mean, what's the difference there?
Well, so this is a phrase that came from the Irish poet Patrick Kavanagh, and he described the provincial artist or the provincial manager as someone who's always looking to the city for kind of what's cool. So they're kind of phonies in the sense that they're always trying to imitate what's in fashion. So in a managerial setting, this would be somebody who's always looking at the CEO to know what the CEO wants said. The parochial person, in Kavanagh's view, is the opposite, which is they're just digging deep inside where they are to think about the truth of there. So this is, never mind what the CEO is thinking. In the face of the problem we're trying to solve, what is the deepest, truest knowledge I can bring to the table? It's not about, I want to be as fancy as the big guys. It's about what is the heart of expertise that could really make a difference here. And those are the people you want around you when you're making a complex decision. That they're not currying favor. They're trying to use the greatest of their expertise, their knowledge, and their experience, and bringing that as unvarnished as possible to the table.
Well, I think you're suggesting in the Embracing Uncertainty book that managers could benefit from exposure to the arts, right? So not just sort of exposure to, I don't know, things that might make them better observers or, having courses in observation, right? But rather taking seriously an engagement with the arts. So why, first of all, why is that? And secondly, how would you actually implement that? I mean, could you send them to arts school? Right? I mean, how would we do this?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things. So when I worked in television, I was very struck by that there were some people who seemed to come up with ideas for programs that somehow just seem to come out at the right moment. Now, bearing in mind that the lead time for our TV series is a couple of years, this was definitely not about looking at current trends. It just couldn't have been, because by the time the thing would be made, the train would have left the station. So they somehow
They
had
weren't
a
using data science.
They didn't use data science. They didn't do market research. And I started thinking about that a lot and watching the kind of habits and thought patterns of people like that. And then I started looking at it a bit more rigorously and realizing that these are people who are very open-minded. They are great noticers. They are constantly interrogating the environment in which they work, saying, what does it mean? Does this matter? Is this weird anomaly just a fluke, or could it mean something? Oh, I keep seeing it everywhere now. Maybe it does mean something. And they're confident enough of this process that they'll start working on something before everybody thinks it's a thing. I think this is a pretty invaluable process in a world which is unpredictable. I mean, of course, everyone's telling us now, well, AI can do this. Well, I don't think so. I don't think AI is, walking across the Berkeley campus every day. I don't think AI is walking down the streets of London every day and picking up completely random information and starting to see something inside of it. I think the complex thing in the known universe, aka the human brain, does this pretty brilliantly and deserves a lot more credit for doing so. But this is what artists do all the time. They're ahead of their time. That's why we talk about the avant-garde. And their work lasts their time, which is something that is rarely said about businesses. So I'm not saying this displaces market research. I'm just saying that we are overfitting to the traditional business tools and native human creativity. Early in the book, I cite the chief economist in the Bank of England, who regularly brought artists in to talk about the bank. That changed a lot of the conversations. Well, once you change the conversations, the idea ecosystem is changed. It made people feel much freer about experimenting. It certainly meant eventually daring to have meetings with no agenda. So it's really a way of getting organizations to be able to think more loosely in order to become intrinsically more adaptable.
Well, this means that artists are very powerful, and their power lies not in their providing explanations. And you're very clear, like that's not the business of artists, right? To do explanations, but it is in the power to provoke the capacity to observe and to notice. And this is why they are seen as threats. They're seen as threats by a lot of organizations.
Yeah. So I think you're right that the role of art is not to solve a problem. The role of art is to provoke our thinking. And I think that that's what it does. I mean, the poet Seamus Heaney, in his Oxford lectures, talked about creating glimpsed alternatives. So other ways of seeing the world, other ways of seeing yourself, other ways of seeing history, that the whole point is, if you like, a creative provocation, which is it could be otherwise. If it were otherwise, what would that mean? What would it make you feel? What would it make you do differently? What would it make you think differently? And so it is, if you like, a very profound stimulus, which speaks both to our thinking and to our feelings. And as such, I think is incredibly healthy for us. You're exactly right in saying, of course, that's also why totalitarian regimes want to kill all the artists, because the rhetoric of totalitarianism is always that there is no alternative. What the regime is the only way and the inevitable way. So it specifically seeks to draw you away from alternatives in yourself and in the context. And I think, this is a very provocative thought. I think that's what makes me so angry about the language of inevitability that comes out of Silicon Valley. There will be self-driving cars by 2017, according to Sergey Brin. This is not anything except propaganda as a means to lighten the regulatory load in order to smooth the path for profitable innovation. But it isn't honest. It is a desire to stop thinking rather than engage in a socio-political discourse about, if we're going to introduce self-driving cars, how do we do this so it benefits more people than it harms? Which is the conversation that we should have been having.
Well, I think you make the point that when we're young, we're more comfortable with uncertainty. And it's sort of, we are acculturated to find it a cause of anxiety, right? Whether it's through our education or whether it's through the organizational culture or through the political culture, right? And so, so how do we, is there a way to, alter the trajectory of people, earlier in their lives? Like, how can we get people to a place where they are more comfortable with maybe having alternative visions of the future coexisting in their minds at the same time?
Exactly. Well, I think we should, and we could, and countries do, inject more liberal arts into education for longer. Certainly here in the UK, it's very easy for students to stop doing all art subjects at the age of 16, which I think is catastrophic. I'm very alert to the fact that engagement in the liberal arts in the United States has fallen off a cliff, to quote James Shapiro. I think this is very dangerous, both in the sense that it means we're sending literally very narrow-minded people to university, but it's also very dangerous for democracy if we're essentially educating out of people their capacity to imagine other ways of living, thinking, working, being. Educating out of people the capacity to absorb other points of view. It makes us more brittle and it makes us less resilient. But I also think that we have, as adults, a responsibility to keep alive in ourselves that human capacity. So in just the same way as I look after my physical health, I like to look after, if you like, what I think of as my creative health or my imaginative health. I was very aware a couple of years ago, and maybe this is what started me down this whole track, that I had been writing so hard and working so hard and traveling the world, doing so many speaking engagements. I had become this very efficient, I think quite rigid, super high productive individual with very, very little time for reflection. And I got to the point where I bored myself. And part of what I did was just say, right, that's it. I'm going to take a very long holiday. I think I'm probably quite close to burnout. And I'm only going to read fiction. And now what I do is I read fiction all year long instead of just on holidays. I take myself off to the things that give me joy or provocation. I went to an incredible concert a couple of weeks ago of a combination of Schoenberg and Strauss waltzes, which, sounds completely mad and was totally exhilarating. It was the greatest resurrection of Schoenberg imaginable. And he and the orchestra played his arrangements of the Strauss waltzes. Who knew that Schoenberg loved Strauss, right? So that was, I was thinking about it this morning when I got up. It was just absolutely exhilarating to think another binary bites the dust, I've just come back from Rome, where I went to a museum, astonishing museum, a historian friend of mine recommended, which is set in a Belle Epoque power station. It was one of the first power stations in Rome, and it's full of these gigantic diesel engines. But this is the setting for a phenomenal collection of ancient Greek and Roman statuary. Now, that's a really fascinating contrast and very, very thought-provoking in terms of past civilizations, right? The past civilizations of Greece and Rome and the past civilization of fossil fuels. So I try to integrate this stuff into my life the same way as I try to integrate, healthy eating and exercise, because I do have an old-fashioned belief that if I'm going to write about something, I kind of have to live according to it. And if I do believe, as I write, that keeping imaginative, creative minds healthy and well-stocked is fundamental, then I need to do that for myself, not just preach about it.
Well, we just have to make sure that we don't take our pursuit of the arts and turn it into a rigid plan.
And not turn it into a chore. No, I think that's absolutely right. Absolutely right. And there are days I think, yeah, I know, Margaret, you should, take an hour and read something for fun. But you know what? Why don't you just finish the piece you're doing? Hit your deadline. So I think, engineers talk a lot about tight and loose. I think much that has gone wrong in organizational life is a function of being too tight. And it sounds very counterintuitive because it is counterintuitive, but uncertainty requires that we loosen up in order to be able to respond more flexibly. And I think you're exactly right. That pertains as much to us as individuals as it does to the largest corporations in the world.
Well, Margaret, thank you so much for joining me. I was hoping to get you after this book, but I'm glad I waited because I got to get this book as well. And don't forget, of course, Willful Blindness. Let's chat again soon.
Well, thank you for a fantastic conversation. It's the end of my working day here in the UK, and I can't think of a better way to finish it off. So thank you, Greg. It was really hugely enjoyable. It gave me lots to think about.
unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.